Chapter 7, of the Sinking of the Titanic. Written by J. Henry Mowbray in the year 1912. Narration by Ambience World. J. Bruce Ismay, Managing Director of the White Star Line, who has been widely charged with cowardice in saving himself when the Titanic was wrecked, has found his first defender in the person of August H. Wakeman, Commodore Barber of that company's fleet, who was chief ship's barber on the ill-fated vessel. Wakeman declares that he was a witness of the scene when Ismay left the vessel, and that he literally was thrown into the lifeboat by a seaman who did not recognize him and thought he was interfering with the work. He asserts that Ismay was striving valiantly to help in the work of launching the boats, and went overboard only under physical compulsion. Wakeman was accompanied to his home in Palmyra, New Jersey, by his brothers-in-law, A. H. and John Hendricks, who tell of a vexatious experience in getting him off the Carpathia. Wakeman was badly injured when he was blown off the ship by the explosion of the boilers. A. H. Hendricks charges that the custom officials refused him a pass to the pier because he wanted to get a member of the ship's crew, and the official said they were not bothering about the crew. The brothers finally made their way to the pier by running between double lines of automobiles. Wakeman was brought off the Carpathia on a rolling chair, too late to catch the special train which came to this city, and the Pennsylvania Railroad officials provided him with a berth, free of charge. "I was in my barber shop reading," said Wakeman, "when I felt a slight jar, and realized we had struck something. I went to the gymnasium to see whether others had noticed it. I found some of the men punching the bag, while Colonel Astor, Mr. Widener, and a number of others were watching them. I had known Mr. Widener for some time, and I advised him to put on a life belt. He laughed at me. 'What sense is there in that? This boat isn't going to sink,' he said to me. 'There is plenty of time. We're safer here than in a small boat, anyway.' Then came the order to man the boats, and I went on deck to help. I saw Mr. Ismay at the rail, directing and helping the men. One of them did not recognize him and said, 'What are you interfering for? You get back out of the way.' Another seaman warned the first man that he was speaking to the head of the line. 'I don't care who he is, he's got to get back, or go overboard. We can't be bothered with him and his orders now,' was the reply. Mr. Ismay stuck to his place, and continued giving orders and directing the men. The rule was observed, of sending over 4 women and then a man to look after them. When 4 women had been put over, the seaman turned to Mr. Ismay, and ordered him over the side. Mr. Ismay refused to go, when the seaman seized him, rushed him to the rail, and hurled him over. I saw that myself, and I know that Mr. Ismay did not go of his own accord, and that the charge of cowardice is unfair and untrue. While I was still helping at the boats, there came an explosion from below decks, and the ship took an awful lunge, throwing everybody into a heap. I was hurled clear of the vessel's side, and landed on top of a bundle of deck chairs, which was floating on the water. I was badly bruised, and my back was sprained. My watch stopped at 1:50 a.m., and I believe it was at that time I was thrown into the water. While I lay floating on the bundle of chairs, there came another terrific explosion, and the ship seemed to split in 2. There was a rain of wreckage, and a big piece of timber fell on me, striking my life belt. I believe if it had not been for the belt, I would have been killed. I floated for what I believe was about 2 hours. Then arms reached down and drew me aboard a life raft. The man who did this was a seaman named Brown, whose life I probably had saved 2 years ago by hurrying him to a hospital in England when he was taken ill suddenly. There were 6 persons on the raft, and others were in the water up to their necks, hanging on to the edges of the raft. The raft was already awash, and we could not take them aboard. One by one, as they became chilled through, they bade us goodbye and sank. In the bottom of the raft was a man whom I had shaved that morning, and whom I had been told was worth $5 million. I did not know his name. He was dead. And so we floated on the raft, bereft of hope, and stupefied by the calamity, until picked up by the Carpathia. I was so badly injured, they had to take me on board, in a boatswain's chair. The happiness of husbands, at seeing their wives put in the way of safety from the Titanic, was described by Mrs. Turrell Cavendish, daughter of Henry Seagull. She said, "I was with my husband in our stateroom, when the accident happened. He awakened me, I remember it was midnight, and told me something was the matter with the boat. My husband kissed me and put me into a boat, in which were 23 women. He told me to go, and that he would stay on the ship, with the other men. They were happy to see their wives lowered away, in the boats. They kept telling us, they would be all right, because the ship could not sink. We were lowered into the water without any light, only one man tried to get into the boat. He was pushed back by a sailor. Most of the women in the boat I was in, were in their bare feet. I can still see those husbands, kissing their wives, and telling them goodbye. I can see the sailors standing by so calm, and brave. The sight of those good men, who gave their lives for others, will always be with me. Words can't tell the tale of their sacrifice. The hours we spent in that small boat, after those heroic men went down, were hours of torture. When we got on the Carpathia, we were treated with the utmost consideration. I saw Mr. Ismay, when he came on board. He was trembling from head to foot, and kept saying, "I'm Ismay, I'm Ismay." Immediately upon their disembarkation from the Carpathia, Mr. and Mrs. William E. Carter, Miss Lucille Carter and William E. Carter Jr., of Newport, and 2116 Walnut Street, Philadelphia, about whom so much anxiety was felt, for the first 24 hours, after the news of the Titanic disaster reached the mainland, went in taxicabs to the home of William Dickerman, at 89 Madison Avenue. Mr. Dickerman is a brother-in-law of Mr. Carter. I kissed my husband goodbye, and as he stood on the deck, I went down the side, to a lifeboat. There were no seamen there. It was life or death. I took an oar and started to row, said Mrs. Carter, who was formerly Miss Lucille Polk, of Baltimore, when seen later at the Madison Avenue house. Mrs. Carter had just come from the ship, and the tears were still in her eyes, glad tears from the welcome she had received, from her relatives, among whom was Anderson Polk, who had come to New York to meet her. She told of being roused from her sleep, at 14 minutes of 12, on Sunday night, by the sudden crash, of rushing out on the deck, to find the chaos of destruction, quickly from itself into the decisive action, of brave men, about to face their death. Clasping her hands tightly, she told how the men had stood back, or else helped to lower away the lifeboats, and then, kissing their wives, bade them a goodbye, which they thought would be forever. In brief words, tensely spoken, she told of going into the lifeboat, and taking an oar. At 10 minutes past 1 o'clock, there was a sudden explosion, and the giant hulk of the Titanic blew up, rearing in the water like a spurred horse, and then sinking beneath the waves. She had to pull hard with her oars, in the desperate attempt, which the poorly manned lifeboat had to make to keep from being sucked down with the diving Titanic. After minutes of work, with the desperation of death, they made their way out of the suction, and were saved. It was not until she was taken aboard the Carpathia, that she met her husband, saved because he had to man an oar in another lifeboat. "We had a pleasant voyage from England," began Mrs. Carter. "The ship behaved splendidly, and we did not anticipate any trouble at all. I had retired on Sunday night, an hour before we struck the iceberg. The men were in the cabin smoking. Most of them were in the smoking room, when the ship hit. The first I knew of the accident was a tremendous thump, which nearly threw me out of my berth. I realized that something must have happened, and feared that it was a bad accident. A moment later, my husband came down to the stateroom, and told me that we had struck an iceberg. There was no confusion. I dressed myself hurriedly and went on deck, with my children. The ship was badly damaged. The officers thought at first that she would not sink, and we were told to be calm. But it was not long before we knew that the ship could not long stand the strain of the water, which was pouring into the bow, and bearing the ship down on her forward part. Then came the time when we knew that it must either be the lifeboats, or stay on the ship and sink with her. The seamen began to lower away the lifeboats. One after another, they released whatever machinery held them, and they dropped into the ocean. There was ice all about us, and the night being comparatively clear, we could see the floes around us, when we peered down over the side of the ship. When the boats had been lowered, then it was that the time of parting came. There was no excitement. Every one of the men, whose wives or women folk were with them, took them to the side of the ship, where a lifeboat was waiting, and kissed them over the side. Major Archibald Butt remained on board, and went down with the ship. Colonel Astor also went down with the ship. Mrs. Astor was in my boat. The colonel took her to the side, and kissed her and saw her over the side. When I went over the side with my children, and got in the boat, there were no seamen in it. Then came a few men, but there were oars, with no one to use them. The boat had been filled with passengers, and there was nothing else for me to do, but to take an oar. We could see now that the time of the ship had come. She was sinking, and we were warned by the cries from the men above, to pull away from the ship, quickly. Mrs. Thayer, wife of the Vice President of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was in my boat, and she, too, took an oar. It was cold, and we had no time to clothe ourselves with warm overcoats. The rowing warmed me. We started to pull away from the ship. We could see the dim outlines of the decks above, but we could not recognize anybody. We had pulled our lifeboat away from the Titanic, for a distance of about a city block. That is about all, I should say, when the Titanic seemed to shake to pieces. The ship had struck about 14 minutes to 12. It was 10 minutes past 1, when we saw her lunge. She had exploded. There was a rumbling noise within her, then she gave a lurch, and started to go down. We realized what it meant. That the sinking ship would suck us under with her. It was a moment later that the suction struck us. It was all we could do to keep from being caught, so strong was the drag down that followed the Titanic. But we pulled away at last, after straining as hard as we could at the oars. Then we were alone in the boat, and it seemed darker. We remained in the boat all night, waiting for daylight to come. It came at last, and when it broke over the sea, we saw ice floes all about it. It was about 8:30 o'clock, when the Carpathia came into sight. I can't tell how I felt when I saw her. I had believed that my husband had gone down on the ship. It was not until after we were taken over the side of the Carpathia that I saw him. Mr. Carter had been compelled to take an oar in a lifeboat that was not sufficiently manned. That is how he came to be saved. All of the men waited for the women to go first. Mr. Carter was among the number. When he put me into a lifeboat he stayed back, and I had thought when I saw the ship blow up and sink that he had gone down with her. Mr. Ismay does not deserve any criticism for being saved. He was another of those who had to man an oar in a lifeboat so as to get the boats out of danger by being sucked under by the sinking Titanic. 3 French survivors, Fernand Aumont, Pierre Maréchal, son of the well-known French admiral, and Paul Chevre, the sculptor, conjointly cabled to the Matin, a graphic narrative of the disaster to the Titanic, in which they repeatedly insist that more lives could have been saved if the passengers had not had such dogged faith that the Titanic was unsinkable. Several boats, they declared, could have carried double the number. The three Frenchmen say that they were playing bridge with a Philadelphian when a great, crunching mass of ice packed up against the portholes. As they rushed on deck, there was much confusion, but this quickly died down. One of the officers, when questioned by a woman passenger, humorously replied, "Do not be afraid. We are merely cutting a whale in two." Presently the captain appeared to become somewhat nervous, and ordered all to put on life preservers. The boats were then lowered, but only a few people stirred, and several of the boats put off half empty, one with only 15 persons in it. When the Frenchman's boat rowed off for half a mile, the Titanic presented a fairy-like picture, illuminated from stem to stern. Then suddenly, the lights began to go out, and the stern reared up high in the air. An immense clamor rose on all sides, and during an hour, anguished cries rang out. It was, say the narrators, like a great chorus, chanting a refrain of death, with wild obstinacy. Sometimes the cries died out, and then the tragic chorus began again, more terribly, and more despairingly. The narrative continues. Those shrieks pursued us and haunted us, as we pulled away in the night. Then one by one, the cries ceased, and only the noise of the sea remained. The Titanic was engulfed almost, without a murmur. Her stern quivered in a final spasm, and then disappeared. The Frenchmen and their companions suffered bitterly from the cold. They cried out to attract attention, and a German baron, who was with them, emptied his revolver in the air. When finally the Carpathia appeared, a feeble hurrah went up from the small boats, every one of which moved as swiftly as possible toward the liner. The Frenchmen related tragic incidents as they were leaving the sides of the Titanic. After all the boats had been launched, many of the passengers who had stayed behind too long tried to embark on a collapsible raft, which worked badly. 50 persons climbed onto the raft, which was half filled with water. One after another, the passengers on the raft were drowned, or perished with the cold. When a body was found in the way, it was thrown overboard, and only 15 of the 50, who had taken refuge on the raft, were saved by the Carpathia. If you are enjoying Ambience World's narration of the sinking of the Titanic, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell, so that you will not miss out on the next chapters.